Costco becomes the largest company yet to sue the Trump administration over tariffs. Costco filed the lawsuit in order to secure a full refund on the tariffs they paid if the Supreme Court rules the president's sweeping tariffs illegal. You may remember the court heard arguments on these tariffs last month, but they have not said when a ruling might be made. Other companies, including Revlon and Bumblebee Foods, have filed similar lawsuits.
We are getting a new look at prices at the grocery store. July Consumer Price Index shows inflation for food prices over the past month. That's steady, but over the past year, that number is 2.9%. Recent polling shows that Americans are worried about the cost of food. In fact, 53% say grocery prices are a major stress. Joining us now is
Costco is suing the Trump administration over tariffs. Costco says it wants a full refund of all tariffs collected under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which was a result of President Trump's executive order, which imposed what he called reciprocal tariffs. The retail giant is the latest company to file suit against a federal agency over the president's signature economic policy. U.S. Customs and Border Protection data through late September shows a total of nearly $90 billion has been paid by importers.
When the boardroom screens flickered to life, no one expected the map to glow bright red across the United States. But there it was, Costco's internal forecast showing something unthinkable: collapsing demand curves, shrinking margins, and a migration of their future profits far from American shores. At first, analysts called it a glitch. Then Africa's retail boom numbers rolled in, numbers so explosive, so undeniable that silence swallowed the room.
Well, get this, Costco Wholesale is suing the Trump administration over tariffs. In the lawsuit filed on Friday, Costco says it is seeking a full refund of all tariffs collected under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a result of President Donald Trump's executive order, which imposed what he called reciprocal tariffs. The legality of Trump's sweeping tariff agenda is currently under review by the Supreme Court.
By the time the final slide appeared, one truth became impossible to ignore. The next trillion-dollar market wasn't in America anymore, and Costco was preparing to make the boldest shift in its history.
Right about people feeling it. You know, when we talked about this interview happening, we had people reach out from around the country. Regina Foley messaged me, and she says she is retired in Greensboro, North Carolina. She is a registered Republican all her life. She voted for you 3 different times, but she is not happy about how her prices have not come down that she sees. And she said this, quote, "I want the Republicans to keep control of Congress in 2026, but something has to be done fast. I don't see the best economy right now. Wall Street numbers do not reflect my Main Street money. Please do something, President Trump." So I guess, what do you say to Regina and people like her?
Well, I do say this: beef we have to get down. I think of groceries. You know, it's an old-fashioned word, but it's a beautiful word. Beef we have to get down, but we've got prices way down. And think of this: energy. She drives a car, probably, and her energy prices are way down. And energy is so all-encompassing. It's so big that when energy goes down, everything comes down. Everything follows it. And I have energy down to 5-6-year lows now.
You think prices are coming down from this?
I believe that. Yeah, I think they're coming down, but I think they're down already. I think the biggest problem is Republicans don't talk about it. They don't talk about the word affordability, and the Democrats lie about it. Look, when I took over, and I said this, inflation was so bad under Biden. Remember, he had the Inflation Reduction Act. It was
9%. Yeah.
It was a scam. And he tried to lower inflation, but he caused the inflation, and he tried to lower the inflation. He took over my economy where inflation was at 1%, which is perfect, 1%. He drove it 9 or 10 times higher than that in a short period of time. When I took over, it was a mess. I have inflation way down. I have it down to a normal number right now, lower than a normal number, in my opinion, I think. So I do say to her, first of all, I love her because she voted for me 3 times. And I think she'd vote for me again if I had that opportunity.
You're not going to believe this. Costco is suing the Trump administration, saying the tariffs he imposed were never legal in the first place. They want a full refund of every dollar they paid. Costco's argument: the law Trump used doesn't actually let a president set tariffs, and the Supreme Court is already reviewing Trump's entire tariff program. This is big money. Importers have paid so far nearly $90 billion in tariffs, and Costco is...
The announcement didn't come through a press conference or a flashy ceremony. It slipped into the world like a tremor, subtle at first, then violently unmistakable. A quiet disclosure in an earnings call, a single sentence buried beneath financial projections, and the global market froze. A major American retail titan had decided to shift its long-term expansion strategy away from the United States and into Africa, not cautiously, not experimentally, but decisively, massively, and with irreversible commitment. Within hours, analysts were scrambling to interpret what the move meant. Investors panicked, politicians held emergency meetings, and the U.S. agricultural sector felt its stomach drop. The retail giant's decision struck harder than a trade embargo, harder than a sanctions regime because it signaled something the U.S. never expected. To hear Africa, not America, was the future of global retail. No one in Washington had imagined that Africa's markets, once dismissed as emerging, had matured into a powerhouse large enough to pull the center of gravity away from American consumers. But the signs had been there for years. Africa's middle class had grown faster than any on Earth. Its cities expanded at a rate unseen since industrial-era Europe, and its technology adoption had leapfrogged entire generations of Western systems. The company had seen it clearly. Its executives had studied spending patterns across Lagos, Nairobi, Dakar, Accra, Dar es Salaam, Addis Ababa, Kigali, and Johannesburg. They saw cities bursting with young, high-income consumers. They saw manufacturing zones emerging with efficiency rivaling Asia. They saw stability in the African continental free trade area that the world underestimated. And most of all, they saw governments that wanted them partners offering incentives, streamlined trade corridors, and access to hundreds of millions of consumers eager for modern retail ecosystems. Meanwhile, back home, the U.S. market was suffocating. The company's growth curve had flattened. Inflation had drained consumer spending. Power, labor shortages, rising operational costs, political uncertainty, and supply chain bottlenecks battered profits. And the agricultural states the company relied upon had sunk into one crisis after another: droughts, fertilizer shortages, and falling crop yields driving prices higher. The company realized the truth long before America did. The U.S. market had peaked. Africa's was just beginning. The boardroom debate leading to the decision had lasted for months, but the conclusion had been unavoidable. Africa offered land for hyperscale distribution centers at a fraction of U.S. costs. It offered workforce demographics the U.S. could no longer match. It offered consumer enthusiasm unburdened by economic fatigue. And the African Free Trade Area offered something the West struggled to provide: unity. The world interpreted the shift as an indictment of America's fading economic magnetism. The company didn't say it publicly, but insiders admitted it quietly. Return on investment projections in Africa simply dwarfed anything possible in the U.S. Even Europe couldn't compete. Africa's purchasing power had exploded far beyond the expectations of old financial models, and the retail giant knew that whoever claimed Africa first would shape global commerce for decades. When newsroom headlines finally caught up, panic swept through Wall Street. Stocks dropped instantly. U.S. agricultural unions held frantic calls with government officials. Supply chain analysts predicted impending disruption. This was not a small retailer shifting a few stores overseas. This was one of America's most powerful consumer giants deciding to stake its future on an entirely different continent. Reporters rushed to state capitals for comment. Governors from the Midwest states heavily dependent on supplying bulk food products were blindsided. They had assumed their relationship with the retailer was rock solid, guaranteed by decades of steady purchases. But the company had spent months reducing U.S. agricultural orders quietly, redirecting capital toward African partnerships instead. African farmers, processors, and manufacturers saw their fortunes change overnight. The retail giant signed long-term contracts with agricultural hubs in Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Ghana. The deals promised billions in new revenue streams and unprecedented infrastructure upgrades. Cold chain networks began rising across East Africa: massive refrigerated warehouses, solar-powered storage facilities, and digital tracking systems for farm-to-store logistics. It was the kind of investment the U.S. had once specialized in, but now Africa was the one receiving global-scale industrial transformation. The narrative had flipped entirely. African economies, once pressured to rely on the West, now held negotiating power. They weren't begging for investment. Investment was begging for them. In Lagos, the governor celebrated the arrival of a new 1.3 million square foot distribution hub projected to create over 40,000 direct and indirect jobs. In Nairobi, a tech partnership was announced to integrate mobile payments, biometric memberships, and drone-assisted supply tracking. In Accra, construction began. On one of the world's largest retail complexes built entirely using locally produced materials, and in Johannesburg, analysts predicted that South Africa would gain a significant portion of global retail logistics previously dominated by US and Chinese ports. Africa wasn't just receiving investment, it was being reshaped into a retail titan in its own right. Back in America, however, the consequences were brutal. The agricultural sector plunged into crisis. Corn cooperatives issued emergency bulletins. Poultry processors predicted mass layoffs. Dairy groups warned that thousands of farmers faced bankruptcy if the retailer shifted its entire import portfolio to Africa. U.S. warehouses began running under capacity. Transport fleets sat idle. And suppliers felt the shock ripple through every layer of the economy. Politicians were furious. Committees called emergency hearings demanding explanations. Yet no one could force the company to reverse its decision. It was not a political statement. It was an economic inevitability. The company hadn't abandoned America. America had simply stopped being profitable. In private conversations leaked months later, the company's executives described the shift in stark terms. Africa is the next trillion-dollar consumer economy. The United States is no longer the world's growth engine. We adapt or we die. Meanwhile, in Africa, excitement surged like a tidal wave. Governments declared national holidays to celebrate job creation. Local entrepreneurs prepared to integrate with the retail giant's supply chain. Investors from Asia and the Middle East flocked to African cities hoping to purchase land, logistics centers, and manufacturing. Rights before prices soared. The shift had become undeniable. The retail giant's entrance into Africa legitimized what African economists had argued for years, that the continent was not future potential, but present power. And as the world recalibrated its expectations, Africa suddenly found itself in the driver's seat of global commerce. In London, Tokyo, Dubai, and Singapore, financial strategists rushed to update their forecasts. Africa was no longer a side note. It was the new frontier of global consumer expansion. But in Washington, the mood was tense, even terrified. America's lawmakers realized that once a retail giant, one of the strongest pillars of U.S. consumer culture, chose Africa over America, other corporations would follow. The shift would not stop with retail. It would spread to manufacturing, agriculture, technology, logistics, and banking. And so the story of global commerce began to rewrite itself in real time. The U.S. was not collapsing, but it was no longer the center of gravity. Africa was not rising. Africa had risen. And the company's decision was the clearest sign the world had ever seen. The shockwaves of the retail giant's continental shift had not yet settled when another tremor struck the global market. Analysts who once confidently predicted that Africa's economy would mature someday found their models shredded overnight. Africa was no longer waiting for global validation. It had already become the epicenter of the next economic era. The company's move hadn't just altered profit margins, it altered psychology. Corporations followed momentum, and now momentum was pulsing through Africa like electricity through a newly completed power grid. Within months, more companies made announcements that sounded eerily familiar to the retail giant's message. Logistics firms, distribution giants, agricultural processors, and pharmaceutical manufacturers began unveiling investment plans heavily tilted toward Africa. Venture funds in Europe and Asia formed new Africa-dedicated divisions. Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds doubled their stake in African industrial zones. Even South American agribusinesses sought partnerships with African ports and processing plants. Africa's transformation accelerated beyond anything global observers had predicted. New highways began connecting trade corridors from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic. Solar megafarms lit up cities where power outages had once been common. Warehouses grew into smart logistics ecosystems equipped with AI-driven inventory management. African tech hubs expanded into mega campuses that attracted engineers from across the world. And everywhere, cranes filled the skyline, signs of a continent rising with deliberate speed. But the heart of the transformation was consumer power. For the first time in modern history, Africa's middle class outpaced the growth rate of every other region. Families who once struggled financially now found stability, mobility, and choice. A surge in disposable income built thriving economies around entertainment, fashion, food, travel, and lifestyle products. Private schools expanded, hospitals modernized, real estate values doubled in major cities, domestic airlines increased routes. As demand exploded, the company stood at the center of it all. Its new African supercenters were unlike anything in the U.S. They doubled as marketplaces, distribution hubs, and industrial partners to local producers. A single site could support hundreds of suppliers, farmers, manufacturers, textile mills, tech repair shops, packaging firms, and logistics providers. And every partnership was designed with longevity and profit sharing in mind. This wasn't charity. It was business engineered for mutual benefit. In contrast, America's situation worsened. Agricultural regions faced staggering losses. Entire distribution ecosystems destabilized. Trucking companies filed for bankruptcy as demand plummeted. Packaging factories laid off thousands, and local governments begged federal agencies for relief. But Washington struggled to respond. Global economic shifts don't reverse because one government objects. The world had become multipolar, and Africa was emerging as the center of that new polarity. The winds of economics were blowing south, and no policy could redirect them. In the United States, public frustration grew. Citizens questioned why the country had failed to innovate, failed to invest in infrastructure, failed to adapt. How? Had a nation that once led global commerce become the one chasing behind? Politicians pointed fingers, industries blamed regulations, and media outlets hosted daily debates about the country's declining competitiveness. But the truth was deeper. America's downfall in this sector was not the result of any single decision. It was the accumulated consequence of decades of stagnation, political infighting, and failure to recognize global trends. While other nations modernized, the U.S. assumed it would always be the world's top consumer market. Meanwhile, Africa had quietly prepared itself. The company's leaders weren't sentimental. They followed the data, and the data told a story the U.S. did not want to face. Africa offered growth. America offered decline. As the company expanded, African consumers embraced it not as a foreign intruder, but as a partner accelerating their prosperity. Local farmers called it a lifeline. Manufacturers saw it as a doorway to the global market. Young entrepreneurs treated it as a benchmark for world-class business standards. The shift wasn't just economic, it was cultural. The continent's rising middle class began shaping global trends. African fashion influenced global design. African cuisine became mainstream internationally. African digital services gained global subscribers. African fintech platforms outperformed Silicon Valley's predictions. Africa was no longer the next big thing, it was the big thing. In city after city, ribbon-cutting ceremonies filled with music, dancing, and celebration welcomed each new retail complex. Consumers arrived in massive numbers. Social media buzzed with videos of African shoppers filling aisles, exploring product demos, or marveling at the technology woven into each store's design. The company had become a household name across the continent, but one that felt distinctly African because it had woven itself into the continent's economic fabric. Meanwhile, the U.S. struggled to rebuild its footing. Exporters pleaded for new markets, yet their products couldn't compete with Africa's rapidly modernizing agricultural and manufacturing sectors. What America once exported to Africa was now being produced within Africa and produced with growing mastery. But the most significant moment came during an international economic summit held in Addis Ababa. The company's executives appeared on a global stage alongside African leaders. When asked why they had chosen Africa over their home country, they offered a simple response: growth follows people, ambition, and opportunity. Africa has all three. That statement echoed across the world. It confirmed what economists had been whispering privately. The global economy had turned. The continent the world once underestimated was now the engine of commerce, the center of innovation, the heart of demand, the magnet for investment. And America, for the first time in modern economic memory, was not at the center of that story. As markets closed on the day of the summit, financial networks reported something unprecedented. Global capital inflows into Africa reached historic highs, surpassing European inflows for the first time. London, New York, and Frankfurt long. The kings of global finance stood in disbelief, but Africa had earned it. Through reforms, resilience, demographic power, and economic vision, the continent had built the future the world needed. And the retail giant's monumental shift had simply accelerated a transformation already underway. In the end, the company did not destroy America, nor did it rescue Africa. It merely followed the path of growth, and that path led south. As global markets settled into a new normal, one truth stood above all others. Africa was not rising. Africa had risen. And the world, including America, would now have to adjust to a future shaped not in Washington, not in London, and not in Beijing, but in the vibrant, unstoppable economies of the African continent.